Yo, what's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. I'm going to get out today and do a quick run with my Axial Ryft Crawler build. I just added four-wheel steer to this thing. So added a front axle on the rear, and I got some four-wheel steer going on this just because the size of this truck, it really kind of makes it a little bit hard to maneuver in tight trails. So four-wheel steer is going to help this thing immensely. It's something I wanted to do for a while, but I'd say I was inspired by the recent release of the Axial Helaman. I was so ready to buy that truck, and I kind of waited. I hesitated a little bit. On the first day it was released, I was ready to pre-order it, and I hesitated a bit, and I watched some of the videos, and I started just becoming a little bit less impressed with it. It does have the really cool feature of the ASD that you can add to both axles as well as the transmission, which is essentially just an individual dig for each wheel, and then also a front and a rear dig built into the trans. So I like that feature a lot, but I started thinking, you know what, 600 bucks for that crawler. And then by the time you go and add ASD to the front axle and to the trans, buy all your micro servos, and then I would want to add four-wheel steer to it as well. That quickly becomes $1,000, $1,200 bill by the time you upgrade the motor and the electronics and everything else. And it just seemed like a lot to have something that ends up being very similar to my Ryft Crawler, because in terms of the size of it, this is the exact same size. This is in fact a quarter-inch longer wheelbase, and depending on your offset on your wheels, it's about a quarter-inch wider track width. But you can change that up pretty easily. You could even go and change the wheelbase on here. You can see I'm running these high clearance links. I could run shorter links on here and get that wheelbase. So essentially, this is the same size as a Helaman. This is an eighth scale. In the crawler world, this is an eighth scale. Of course, in rock racer world, this is considered 10th scale. But when you put this next to a Helaman, it's going to be the same size. So I figured, why am I going to drop 1,200 bucks just to have the ASD feature? It's cool, but somewhere down the road, if I wanted to add that to this truck, all I need to do is buy the axles, right? I could buy two front axles. I could have four-wheel steer with ASD on this truck. So I started thinking that makes a lot more sense. I already have this. This thing is extremely capable as it is. I'm running this on 4S with a Mamba X and an Outrunner motor. This thing is pretty amazing. So I figured, let me invest a little bit more money into this and do a few modifications and see what I can do to turn this into a competitor with the Helaman, maybe even make it better, because I have a plan for this truck that is going to be super cool. I have almost all the parts that I need to do it. So in the very near future, I will be setting this up. I'll give you a little sneak preview. I have a dual motor setup that I'm going to be installing on this Ryft Crawler, and I'm going to have independent. So one motor controlling the rear axle, one motor controlling the front axle, similar to what a motor on axle setup would be. And I'm going to have a mix set up into my radio. So what a dual motor setup is going to do for this, aside from the obvious of doubling the power that this has, and it's also going to double the drag brake capability, right? Because you have the power of two motors. It's going to give me fully independent control of the front and rear motor, which means I can, from my controller, adjust the front and rear overdrive and underdrive. And I will also have an electronically controlled front and rear dig, which means there's no mechanical little herky jerkiness like you get from your typical mechanical dig units, where you almost have to like release or move in reverse for a split second for the dig unit to release, because it has that gear mesh, and it just doesn't. I was never that impressed with mechanical dig units. They're okay, but there's always a little bit of like clunkiness to them, and they don't really function all that smoothly all the time. Or when you're up on a steep climb and you release the dig, you get that little bit of a fallback, and it's enough to really mess you up at times. And the more slop there is in the drivetrain, the more exaggerated that becomes. So with electronic dig, this thing is going to be amazing, because it's literally on off immediately. There is zero hesitation. There is zero movement that's required to just stop a motor from moving. So that's going to be a really cool setup. I can't wait to get that thing done. I'm going to be running dual Outrunner motors in here. I have a tiny little trans. So stay tuned, guys. I will show you that in the very near future. I'll take you through the whole install. And I think it's going to work out great. But let me show you what I have going on here today, and then we're going to get out and run this and just give the rear steer a test, make sure all the bugs are worked out and I'm happy with the setup before I then move on to stripping this thing down again and installing the new trans and dual motors and going through all that. It's going to be a lot of setup in the controller more than anything. So This is pretty basic here. I just took a front axle, stock plastic housing, plastic knuckles, the C-hub, all the stock stuff, and I just mounted it on the rear and added a servo. This is a DS3235 Pro servo. I really like these. A lot of power, especially if you run them on 8.4. Just Trio aluminum links here. And I did have to, so here's the thing. If you're going to run this on a stock trans, which I don't know how many guys are. I don't know how many guys are doing a rock racer setup with four-wheel steer. Let me know if you are. I think it is interesting. I think it could definitely help. I'm just not sure. I always kind of felt like four-wheel steer is more of a crawler setup. You can see here, not the most ideal angle for my rear drive shaft. No, battery's done. All right, shut up. So yeah, not the most ideal angle, but it does work with this 3-gear trans because it's not really as far over to the side as the stock transmission. Stock transmission, your drive shaft is way over here on the edge there. So this, it's acceptable. You can get away with this. Ultimately, once this proves to be working and a good feature that I want to keep on here, I would likely pick up a mirrored rear axle housing. Both Trio and Vitavon make them where it moves the pumpkin from the one side here to the other, so you can keep a much straighter drive shaft angle. But I just wanted to do this kind of quick and easy and cheap, mainly just with the stock housing here that I had already. I had a lot of these parts already. Because of the angle here, I had to go to a longer section on the rear drive shaft. So this is 2 long sections, but everything worked out fine. It's going to be fine for now, at least to get out and do some testing. If you are running dig with this setup, the drive shaft will kind of hit into that. I'm not too worried about it for now because that's all going to be coming out with my dual motor setup. I don't need an extra servo. I don't need that dig unit in there. So it's really going to open up a bunch of space in there, and everything should hopefully work out nice. And if you want to check out more of my setup on this truck, go to my playlists and check out the Axial Ryft playlist, and you'll see pretty much everything I did to this from the start. I have links in my first video, links in the description to these links, and everything else I installed on this. If you want to check out these high clearance links, they're really nice. It's Center of Gravity RC makes these, and they work out extremely well. That's one of the keys to turning this thing into a crawler, is to have this high clearance link back here. But anyway, guys, let's get out and run this, give the rear steer a good test, and then at some point come back, pull this all apart, and start on the next project. So yeah, let's do it. Okay, on to some running video here. First off, try to ignore the whiny sound coming from this ESC. Look, it's just a result of running an outrunner with this Mamba X speed controller. There's just a lot of noise. It's just the way it is. So I'm hoping that when I switch over to the dual motor setup, I am going to be running the same two of this exact same motor. I'm hoping that my new ESCs that I'm running are going to be quieter, because I really can't imagine the sound of 2 of these motors running at the same time. So it doesn't bother me that much. Again, the camera picks up sound better than what your ear would out in the woods here. So it sounds worse than it is. But yeah, it's a noisy truck. But let's talk about the rear steer on this truck. I wish I had done this sooner. It is so much better with the rear steer. Just the size of this truck really makes it a little bit hard to maneuver, especially if you're used to running 10 scale rigs and you're going to drive this in the same area. You're going to really be very aware of the size of this truck and its limited turning capabilities. The rear steer completely changes that. It's so much better. I wish I had done it sooner. You'll see that how I have this thing set up, it's not linked, the rear steer is not linked to the front steering. And that's the way I like to run it. That's just a personal preference. I have this set up on my GT5 radio so that it's a potentiometer knob on the top that it does not return to center. So wherever I set the rear steer, it's going to stay there until I change it. So it can be a little funky at times, like just trying to get it back to the perfectly centered position. You really just have to eyeball it. There really is no detent or anything that you feel for the center, but I don't have an issue with that. I really like being able to just set the rear wheels exactly to the turning radius that I want, and then just leave it there until I correct it again. Or basically you can just keep your fingers on that knob and just tune it. You just kind of steer it as you go. So I like that setup. That's just how I'm used to running it. There's a lot of different ways to set up rear steer, but this is just the way I do it, so I prefer it that way. The one limitation that you run into with turning the Ryft into a crawler is your tires, depending on your wheel offset. If you don't want to run a lot of negative offset, your tires can hit into your suspension links, the lower links, on the front as well as the rear. So when you add rear steer, you're going to, you can see there, I have my endpoints adjusted so that the tires don't really dig into the links. It's not ideal, but when you're using four-wheel steer, you just get such better steering that it becomes less of an issue. Even the front wheels will hit into the links at some point if you have full kind of lock-to-lock steering. So just, it's not a big deal, but again, the Ryft isn't really built to be a crawler, so you do run into some limitations when you try to run it in really rugged terrain like this. Obviously, you would want the most steering that you could get. But again, with the four-wheel steer, it just makes it so much more maneuverable. It's way less of an issue, and it's really going to be dependent on what tire you're using, how much side lug it has, and then also your wheel offset choice. So I'm running the Trio wheels for this that they kind of make for the Ryft. And I like them, but I have recently switched over to just a 2.2 B-Lock I found off Amazon, and I switched over to some Proline Baja Pro X tires, and I think just in terms of looks alone, it's way better. I'm not a big fan of how this rupture tire looks. It's an awesome tire in terms of traction, but I'm kind of sick of looking at them. I have them on too many rigs, and they're a little too like balloonish looking on this truck. So in the next videos you'll see I'm going to be running some different wheels and tires, but the Pro X do have some pretty aggressive side lugs, so I did have to limit my steering a little bit, but again, it's not really an issue. It still has a ton of maneuverability and really makes this truck perform so much better. In terms of servos for the front and rear steer on this truck, I am just running the DS3235 Pros, and if you run them at 8.4 volts, they do have a really good amount of power. Now, that being said, I don't think you could have too much power for this rig. With these big tires and this wide stance, it does really put a lot of strain on your servos. So if you're going to spend money on something, I would recommend just get the most powerful servo and the best rated servo that your budget can afford, and you're not going to be disappointed. I will likely upgrade these at some point. Not sure what I'm going to go with at this time. I am testing a new DS servo that's like a full aluminum case. I think it's rated at 50 kg, so I'm going to do some more testing on that, and it's not crazy expensive. It's in that $60 range, so if that proves to be a good servo, that's probably the way I would go with this, especially having to buy two. But yeah, so that's going to be like kind of an ongoing test, but for now these work great. I don't really have any complaints about these, and they do hold up very well. Anyway, that's going to do it, guys. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned. I'll have more videos on the Ryft in the near future.